All right, let's hope that works. So let's take a look here. Holy cow, go away. Does this cut the slide off too? Not really. Okay. So this slide is underneath module, what are we in, 5? So I'll unlock that tonight so y'all can see it. But this slide is up in Canvas and you'll be able to get to it tonight. And there's some instructions you're gonna have to follow to get Docker up and running. And that's on that link there. All of our development's gonna be browser-based. Your IDE will run in your browser. The only thing you have to install locally on your system is Docker. And you'll do all of the development inside of the IDE, which is inside of a web browser. Yeah. I'm not sure. You'll definitely need some storage. So click on that link. It'll take you to Docker Hub. Docker Hub's a place. So who's familiar with the concept of Docker, even if you haven't used it? Only like the same people that have used it. Okay, so Docker, who's familiar with virtual machines and virtual boxes? Many more people. Okay, so the difference between a virtual box and a Docker container that runs on your host is that Docker doesn't require a hypervisor unless you're on Windows. That's a little murky, but if you're on Linux or if you're on Mac, there's no hypervisor element, which means the kernel on your operating system is shared amongst all of the Docker containers. Whereas if you're running a virtual machine, that hypervisor provides you a kernel per virtual box. So Docker does not provide that. So Docker is a little bit more lightweight. And I can create what are called Docker images, and they're self-contained. They're sort of like, what does VirtualBox have? Like VMDKs. They're essentially self-contained operating systems with tools already installed in them. And I did this because Ruby on Rails, the framework we're going to be using, has a thing called dependency hell. And if everybody's on different versions and different dependencies, it makes it really hard to troubleshoot what everybody's going through. So by using this Docker container that comes from this Docker image that I'll show you how to pull, we're all using the same set of everything. So if you come to me and you have a question, you're using the same thing as somebody else. And so it's sort of my way to control the chaos amongst 40 students all trying to do a software project with a framework that pulls in over 1,000 dependencies for a Hello World application. So iteration 2 is design and planning. So I'm getting you prepared for iteration 3, where you will actually be writing code. But you might need from iteration 2 to iteration 3 to get Docker working. Like, do not wait the last minute to do this. Like, oh, I don't need that till iteration 3. You want to get working on this sooner rather than later. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to install Docker on your computer. And there's good instructions here for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. So you'll just follow the guide from Docker. And they've actually made it much better. I used to feel really bad for people that used Windows with Docker because it wasn't great. But Windows has gotten better with who knows about the Windows subsystem for Linux, WSL. So that's been awesome for Docker. So it's made things a lot easier because under the covers, you're essentially running Ubuntu already. So they streamlined it, should be easy to get up and running. If it's not, if you run into problems during the install, please post in Canvas on the discussion, and we'll all help each other out. Cool. So after you get Docker installed, you should be able to go down to your terminal. And you can type Docker PS. This will work in, if you're on Windows, this will work in the PowerShell terminal. I had an update. So this will work in the PowerShell terminal. It'll work in your Linux, your terminal emulator on Linux. I'm on Mac, so you can see that example here. But once you have Docker installed, you can use, for Windows, I would recommend the PowerShell. You could probably use the command prompt, the MS-DOS piece too, but I'd use the command prompt. And then you can run Docker PS, and there's a bunch of Docker commands. If Docker's running, that would also be good. Just like for it to run. It needs escalated privileges. Go away. And when this pops up, we should see you will all have a similar UI. Unless you're on Linux, you may not actually end up with the UI depending on how you install Docker. But it's okay, we don't ever use this UI other than to make sure that Docker starts. Everything else we're going to do with Docker will be run inside the command prompt. Come on, you. It doesn't. My screen's like that big right now on my laptop because it's connected to the projector. Okay, cool. So Docker's now running. Why is it? So now, who knows what PSEF does? Linux command, PSEF. It lists all my processes, PSEF. So Docker has got Docker PS, which lists all my Docker processes. I don't have any Docker processes currently running. Let's fix that. So after you get Docker installed, you should be able to, you'll get that UI will pop up, says Docker engine started. Excellent, you can move on to the next step. You'll just copy and paste this command right into your terminal. Docker pull, cool, I already had it. This image, trying to remember how big it is. It's gigs. So it might take a little while for it to download depending on your internet. At home, for me, it takes about 2 or 3 minutes. But if you've got slow internet, I would recommend doing that here at school so you're not waiting a long time for that command to work. After that, you can just go on to step 3 and you can get up and running. I would recommend running this first command. This is the simplest and easiest way to get started. The second command down here is how you do a volume mount into the Docker container. Anybody familiar with volume mounts with virtual machines? Like one person, a little. So a volume mount will take a volume on your host operating system. And by volume, I just mean like a folder. They'll just take that folder on your host and it will mirror that folder inside of the Docker image. And so when your Docker image turns into a container, you can share files between your host and that container. The benefit of this is if something bad happens to your container, your files are on your host, right? But if you're not familiar with volumes, then you could really mess a lot of stuff up for yourself. And that's why when you start coding, we recommend pushing to GitHub early and often. GitHub will be the place for you to store your code. And that way, if something does happen to your container and you lose the stuff that was in the container, your source code is up in GitHub. GitHub will be like your networking drive, like where you want to save everything off to. So if you're not familiar with volumes, go ahead and run this command. And what we're telling Docker to do, saying Docker, run this image and expose port 80. What runs on port 80? HTTP, your web server. And so we're saying take the host port and map it to the container port. Yeah. No. And then you've got the other port, port 3000. What do you think runs on port 3000? Whatever you want. Yeah, port 3000 is what Ruby on Rails runs its application on. So when you go to test your application, you will go to localhost 3000, and that will be where your Rails server is. Cool. So we're saying expose port 80 and expose port 3000. And now when I run Docker PS, I can see I've got a container ID running this image. It's been up for 5 seconds. Well, it was created 5 seconds ago. It's been up for 2. And it's taking port 80 and port 3000 from my host and port forwarding into the container. Who knows why there's 0000 there? What does that mean? In a way, well, localhost is 127.0.0.1, right? So what's 0000? 0.0.0.0. If you run something on that interface, 0.0.0.0, you're saying I'm going to allow anybody that knows my IP address to hit port 80 or port 3000. So, but you're going to need that, and I'll show you why here in a minute. So that's running. And now, like I said, we opened up port 80 on my local box. So what does that mean? What can I do now? Yeah, so now I can go to my browser and I can type localhost. I don't have to put :80, right? Because 80 is the default port. And you don't have to use any of this stuff. So you can see I've got an IDE that came up, which is good. So now we can go back to the instructions, wherever those were. There they are. So we got that running, and now we can copy this URL and paste it up here. It says, use my local host and take me to the folder /root. So what's /root? Who remembers from their Unix class? /root, yeah. /root is the root directory on the Linux operating system. So you're going to the root folder on the inside the container. I don't need to pick a color scheme. And I've got stuff already in my root folder. You will not have anything over here. Nothing here. Do you? Oh, okay. Yeah. I must have added those in, but that's fine. Excellent. So you should see something that looks like this. I forgot I did that. I needed, yeah, for permissions. I had to be there. Cool. So now you can go to this little hamburger menu. You can go down to terminal and new terminal. And from here on out, anytime there's instructions that reference a terminal command, you're going to do it here, not on your local box. Because Ruby on Rails is not installed in your local box. Ruby on Rails is installed inside this Docker container that's running in your web browser now. And so what you have in here is different than what's on your host. So if you were on your host and you were to type ruby-v, more likely than not, you probably won't have Ruby installed. You might, but it probably might. If you do, it's probably not 2.7. Or if you type Rails-v, I can guarantee most of you won't have Rails installed. But all of that came with that Docker image, so you didn't have to spend time installing Ruby, installing Rails, installing all the other dependencies. You were able to get it because I essentially gave you the project as a tarball called the Docker image. I said, here's everything you need. So now we can go back to the instructions. And says create Rails new app. So we'll copy this and remember, notice here it says paste this into the terminal, which is here. Type clear. And notice how I don't have any folder over here called new app, right? There's no folder there. This command will create that for me. And it goes out and it downloads the internet. It pulls down all the dependencies for a vanilla Ruby on Rails application. Yeah. I picked VS Code when I made the image. If I used to use a thing called Cloud9, but then they started charging for it. But yeah, if you can find another web-based IDE, when you build the image, you could replace that, so you're not using VS Code.
You learn in Ruby on Rails.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, you'll be doing Ruby on Rails dev through this. Cool. Now I can see my app name, and I can see, oh look, it created all kinds of magic for me. Huh. Views. Look, there's like HTML stuff it created. But just like a regular IDE, you can traverse files over here on the left. Let's go back to our instructions. So we ran that. We're like, okay, now we'll CD into, what's CD stand for? Change directory. So CD into app name. Now I can type LSAL, which just says list all the files. And pretty much I see the same stuff over here that I see over here. But now that I'm in that directory, let's go back to the instructions. And it says run this command. And this command, S stands for server. So you're saying, hey, Rails, stand up a web server for me and bind it to that 0.0.0.0 piece. Again, inside of the container, this can be a little bit higher for most of you. You may not understand, but if you were to bind this to 127.0.0.1, that would bind to inside the container. and you cannot get to inside the container from your web browser, right? Because this browser runs on your host. So if you were to bind this to localhost, your Docker container has its own networking. So if you bind to localhost inside the container, that is that localhost. That is not your network. So we get into this thing, what we call Dockerception. For anybody that's seen Inception, these got layers of things, right? So that's why we tell it to bind to 0.0.0.0. If you run this command without the -b, it'll look like everything starts, except when you try and view the application. It won't be there, right? Because you can't get to it because it's running inside of the container. Let's run that. So I can see here listening on TCP 0.0.0.0.3000. What that means for me is that now I can go to localhost port 3000. Yay, you're on Rails. Yeah.
No, set it,
Yeah, you can. So where I did the -p, you could I haven't tested this, but you could probably do 127.0.0.1:80. So it's only on that machine. Probably. You're welcome to try. Yeah, I didn't want to make the instructions too complicated though. But yeah, I want you guys to play around with this and have fun. And if you care to see the code for the Docker image, it's on GitHub. I can give that to you so you can see how I built the image that created the container. The purpose of this class, right, isn't necessarily to teach you Docker, but if you care to learn, you can come see me during office hours and we can geek out. But if you can get to this point, then your IDE is set up. Yeah.
Every time you're accessing your IDE, you have to go through the entire setup process again.
No.
IDE ready.
Yep. So if, like, let's say you reboot your system, in that image, and you come back and you can't get to localhost because nothing's there. The easiest way, I guess, would be to go to your UI, and you only have one thing listed over here. But notice how these are gray. It's because they're not running. So you'll have something similar to this where it's gray because it's not running, and you can start it by clicking on it, and then there's start and stop buttons here. So if you reboot your system and your container's not running, you can just hit the play button and get back to it. So you should only run through those setup instructions one time. Only do it one time. Otherwise, if you run through it multiple times, you're going to have multiple containers running, and you're going to have code all over the place in different containers. So once you run through the setup, that's it. And if you need help, come see me during office hours or come see Nick. Yeah.
Are we calling it down?
For this part, this is purely testing. Once you get to this point where you can actually see you're on Rails, we blow away the app name. Yep. Yeah, that app name will not progress any further than this. It's just for testing to make sure that port 80 is open and port 3000 is open, that you can actually get to it. So when we go to iteration 3, I will tell you exactly what to name everything. Yep, I'm very prescriptive. Yep. You're gonna have to play around. And like I said, you can post the errors on Canvas and the discussions, and we can take a look with what you did. Yes, so do not wait, get started on this, because this IDE will be used for those of you that decide to do the extra credit in iteration 2. Cool. I know there's probably not a lot of questions now, but the sooner you try this, you'll come up with questions, and you need to come see me either during office hours or post on Canvas on the discussion. But yeah.
Once we start the coding, will we have RSA questions still?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, I want to make sure you understand the textbook reason, the Scholastic reason, and then I want to see you apply that into the project. Yep, because a lot of people, that book work is new to them. A lot of, like, we're not all starting at the same level. So you need to understand the curriculum piece, and then we'll see how you apply it. So yes, you'll still be doing homework with writing. Try and drive that home. Yeah.
I have an installation error. Should I still just
Yep.
make a lot of people
Yep, yeah. Post it, and then we will troubleshoot to see what's going on, because I got more stuff to cover with you guys tonight. Cool. So again, my slides are up under Module 5. I will launch them tonight. Those slides will give you access to this individual project development environment, which gives you the link to follow those instructions. Cool. Are there any other questions before we switch gears and start talking more about software design? All right. Let me stop. Teams is killing my system, so let me stop the recording.